Hrathen spent 3 months preaching against the demons of Elantris. When he died, they buried him inside its walls. Let's find out how a Wyrn of Shu-Dereth ended up in that grave, honoured by a woman who followed the very faith he had sworn to wipe out. Welcome to Second Breakfast. My name's Lee. Join me as we explore the lore, theories, and biggest questions of the Cosmere. Because if I have the questions, maybe you do too. If that sounds like your cup of tea, consider subscribing and joining us for future journeys into the Cosmere. Elantris is a city that its people once worshipped. Ordinary men and women taken at random, transformed overnight into radiant beings who could reshape reality by drawing symbols in the air called aeons. Brandon has said that he built the system to be more mathematical than mystical. Runes with qualifiers and functions. Then, 10 years before the book opens, that magic broke. That transformation we just mentioned, it changed. It now produced something else entirely. Grey, wrinkled, unable to heal, unable to die, and so cursed that every injury they take stays with them and it never fades. Over the 10 years since, the once gleaming city has decayed into filth and grime, and the survivors have been walled inside it. Elantris is in Arelon, and sharing the continent with Arelon is Fjordell, an empire that has spent generations swallowing nearly every nation around it, mostly without an army, and using a religion instead. That religion is called Shu-Dereth, and its central premise is this. When every last person on the planet is united under one ruler, their god Shu-Dereth will wake from his slumber beneath the earth and return to reign. That one ruler is the Wyrn of Fjordell, the only man permitted to serve Shu-Dereth directly. Everyone else serves the person one rung above them, in a chain of obedience that runs all the way up to the Wyrn. Salvation, in other words, means obedience. Convert a country's nobility, and you've converted the country. The most recent nation to fall was Duladel, the republic on Arelon's own border, taken by the Empire just a few years before the book begins. By the time Hrathen arrives, just 2 free nations are left. Arelon, where Elantris is rotting, and Teod. The man Fjordell sends to take Arelon is a priest named Hrathen, and he asks for the job. The assignment came at his own request, granted by the Wyrn himself. Convert the nation within 3 months. But if he fails, the Empire will stop asking and come with its soldiers, and everyone who hasn't converted will die. When he arrives to convert the city, he thinks to himself, someday they will call him their saviour. Hrathen has served the Derethi church since he was a boy, but the fervour that first drove him to it died young, in a single moment at a monastery called Dakhor. He doesn't believe in Shu-Dereth the way you'd expect a fanatic to believe. He believes in it the way you'd believe in logic, with no heat and no joy. He follows this religion because the argument for it holds up, and that has been enough for him for most of his life. It wasn't always like that. As a boy, he was sent to Dakhor, the most elite of Fjordell's monasteries. Every Derethi priest trains at one of these monasteries, and most of them produce ordinary soldiers. Dakhor produces something stranger. Its monks use magic that twists their own bones into ancient patterns you can see ridged beneath the skin, and those shapes grant them strength and speed that no ordinary body could match, along with bones so hard that weapons barely mark them. But the monastery's greatest powers demand something worse, and to understand what Dakhor really is, you only really need one scene. Hrathen was good enough to be accepted there, and he arrived burning with a real faith, the kind he'd spend the rest of his life unable to feel again. 3 months in, the head of the monastery, a rank named Grugdet, wanted to reach the Wyrn's chambers. It was a walk, a short one, the kind you'd cover really without thinking. Instead, he ordered one of the monks under his command to chant a ritual that killed him, and the death teleported the Grugdet to the Wyrn's chambers in an instant. A man died so that his superior wouldn't have to walk down a corridor. The scene was enough for Hrathen. He walked away from Dakhor and never completed the full transformation, carrying out only what they had already done to him. A single bone in his forearm twisted into one of those ancient patterns. A moment like that might have shattered another man's faith, but Hrathen's held. But it was the first sign of Hrathen's empathy and a willingness to ask questions of his faith. Following this, however, he went straight to another monastery, finished his training, and rose quickly, becoming a Wyrn while still young for the rank, one of only 20 men who answered directly to the Wyrn himself. He never once doubted a word of Shu-Dereth. And Duladel, that republic on Arelon's border, was his doing. Fjordell gave him the job and he took it without an army, working the fault line between a wealth aristocracy and a resentful underclass until the country split open. But the violence didn't stop where he wanted it. The entire ruling class was slaughtered, every last family, and the bloodless conversion he had been sent to achieve had become a slaughter he could not control. A result he feels profoundly guilty for, and an additional light into the tension between Hrathen's internal struggle with his faith's pursuit and his personal feelings. He carries that weight into Arelon. 3 months, no bloodshed. Prove it can be done cleanly. So how do you convert a country in 3 months without hurting anybody? The first thing Hrathen does in Kaye is tidy up. The local Derethi priest running things, a man named Fjordell, has spent 10 years going native, soft on the Arelines and slack in his duties. So Hrathen dismisses him on the spot and ships him back to Fjordell to be retrained. Then he gets to work. Hrathen tells us his method himself in the very first week, talking to a junior priest, an artist. Near the bottom of the ladder, Hrathen sits at the top of. The first step in taking control of a nation, artist, is the simplest. You find someone to hate. He spells it out further in the same breath. You will find that hate can unify people more quickly and more fervently than devotion ever could. The man saying this had had his own fire burned out of him years ago in that room at Dakhor, and he has worked out that the feeling he can't access is a lever he can pull in other people. Hatred is far easier to stir up than devotion, and stirring up is all the conversion really needs. He knows it firsthand because he watched it consume Duladel, and here he is teaching the same method to a subordinate. The first step in carrying out the mission that the Wyrn handed to him. And the someone to hate is sitting right there. A whole city of the cursed, rotting behind a wall in the middle of the country. So Hrathen climbs that wall and preaches it. He calls them Svrakis, which in Shu-Dereth means the damned, the souls of the dead who hated Jareth in life and were left to wander as demons because of it. And during this preach, a woman in the crowd starts asking questions. Simple ones. Slightly stupid ones, really. And by the time she's finished, the sermon is in pieces, and the crowd has watched a Wyrn of the Fjordell Empire get taken apart by a foreign princess who claims not to understand him. That woman is Sarene. She's from Teod, the last free nation besides Arelon, and she has arrived in Kaye as a widow before she was even a wife. Her husband-to-be, Prince Raoden, was taken by the curse, which by Arelish law meant being thrown into Elantris and counted among the dead. Rather than admit that his own heir had become one of the cursed, his father staged a funeral and let the world believe he had died of illness. Sarene stayed anyway, and she understands exactly what Hrathen represents. She's Korathi, a follower of the gentler faith that shares a common root with Shu-Dereth, but preaches unity through love rather than obedience. If Hrathen converts Arelon, her religion loses its last foothold on the continent, and Teod will stand alone. She has decided that he is the problem. Walking back to the chapel afterwards with the wall still visible behind him and Sarene standing on top of it, Hrathen says something he clearly doesn't want to say. She was magnificent. A more subtle sign of Hrathen's internal struggle. In spite of the orders of his superiors and his time spent dehumanising the Elantrians, he cannot help but appreciate Sarene's opposing position in support of them. That reaction is the first hint of something the book keeps buried. Over the coming months, Hrathen develops feelings for Sarene, an attraction to the first person he's met that he considers an equal. He's a man trained to ignore passion, so it never becomes overt, never something he acts on or really fully admits. But it's there, and by the end of it, it will matter more than anything in his theology. From here, every move Hrathen makes runs into the same wall. He builds hatred, and Sarene walks food into Elantris and feeds the people he needs fear. And you can't hate something you've just watched being pitied. He attacks the economy, and Sarene neutralises that too. Every lever he pulls, she's there. And then the king removes himself, arrested midway through a blood ritual, and the throne is suddenly empty. Hrathen has already bribed a nobleman named Telri with the crown in exchange for converting. To block him, Sarene builds a rival claim and marries a duke named Royal, which brings us to the artist. His name is Dilaf, and from the very beginning Hrathen can tell there is something dangerous about it. He watches Dilaf bow to him very early on and reads it straight away. The passion, and behind the passion, ambition. He wonders right there whether he's just being played. And then he uses him anyway. And Dilaf's hatred has a source. Years ago, he brought his sick wife into Elantris to be healed, and the Elantrians left her worse, racked with a pain that never eased until she threw herself from the city wall to escape it. Every atrocity he commits from that point is grief, with a theology built on top of it. The people he once dead really did destroy his wife, and that puts him in deliberate opposition to the man he's shadowing. Hrathen is reason without passion, but Dilaf is fueled by passion, faith that is really unprocessed grief given a target and a scripture. The book is staging an argument between them, an argument about which failure is worse. Hrathen's coldness is monstrous, but there's still a person underneath it, one who feels guilt and one who worries about Sarene. There is still hope there, but Dilaf's grief has burned all of that away. It has no break and no argument left in it, only a wound that wants the world to burn with it. Hrathen keeps noticing things about Dilaf that don't fit. He knows court details and old events no provincial artist should, and speaks like a man far older and far more practiced than he appears. Dilaf eventually stages a public torture of an Elantrian, stoking the hatred of the locals. And while it works better than anything Hrathen achieves, it is the cruelty of the act that Hrathen cannot abide. So he puts a stop to proceedings and enacts a mercy kill for the Elantrian, a line in the sand drawn for his own conscience against the Derethi crusade. And with Dilaf's fervour drawing the crowds away from him, Hrathen needs a miracle of his own, and so he manufactures one. He gets a potion from an apothecary in the Empire's backwaters, a man named Forton that mimics the Elantrian transformation, the Sheod. He drinks it and is thrown into Elantris as one of the cursed, and walks out 5 days later claiming Shu-Dereth healed him. Conversion surge. Brandon has confirmed these potions run on real investiture, so Hrathen built his miracle out of the very magic he had spent every sermon condemning. On top of this, he takes that same potion and turns it on Sarene. He has an assassin slip it to her before her wedding to Royale. When she lifts her veil at the altar and appears to have been taken by the curse, she's thrown into Elantris. Without her, the rival claim collapses, and Telri takes the throne. While she's trapped in the city, her father comes to Hrathen. He contacts Hrathen directly, begging to know what it would take to heal his daughter, with no idea that he's bargaining with the very man who caused her condition. Hrathen names his price: convert to Shu-Dereth. The king swears an oath and means to keep it. So when the potion wears off 5 days later and Sarene walks free, Hrathen has exactly what he wanted. He has just handed his empire not one heathen nation, but 2. That's the man who wanted to save Arelon without spilling blood. The plan collapses. Raoden, the prince everybody thought was dead, turned out to be alive inside Elantris. The Arelon nobility are going to coronate Raoden, and standing at that coronation, Hrathen realises he put Raoden on the throne himself. If he had stuck with hatred, if he had never abandoned the strategy after Sarene started feeding people, Arelon would never in 1,000 years have accepted an Elantrian as king. His own restraint did this, and it was at that point Dilaf drops the mask. The zealous provincial Artith was never any of those things. He was actually a Dakhor monk, and not just any monk, he is the Grugdet at Dakhor Monastery. The very same man who killed a monk to save himself a walk decades ago, in the room where Hrathen's passion died. That was Dilaf. He trained young Hrathen. He's the reason Hrathen's faith went cold in the first place. And now, all those years later, it turns out he had been standing at Hrathen's shoulders the entire time, outranking him from the day that they met, letting Hrathen believe that the oath of service he used to leash him meant anything at all. He says that the Wyrn never expected Hrathen to convert anybody. The mission was a decoy. While Sarene and her ally spent 3 months fighting his schemes, Dilaf's monks were quietly getting into position to carry out the real threat: convert or be destroyed. The destruction was always coming, and his conversion effort was simply the cover. And remember, the Arelon mission came at Hrathen's request. Fjorden's priests had worked Arelon for 300 years without converting it, and the Empire had already settled on wiping it out instead. But Hrathen asked to try anyway. Whether the Wyrn set him up or simply let him volunteer for his own humiliation, the man walked into it on his own 2 feet. After beginning his attack on the city, Dilaf takes Raoden and uses him as bait. Sarene is the one he actually wants, and he captures the new king to lure her out into the open, and once she's taken, Raoden has served his purpose, so Dilaf stabs him and leaves him for dead. And then Dilaf moves on Teod, dragging Hrathen and Sarene with him. The distance to Teod is covered in the same way it was back at Dakhor. A monk chants away his own life, and the death carries the whole party across the sea in an instant. In Teod, Hrathen overhears Dilaf laying out how he means to do it: kill Sarene in front of her father, so he watches his daughter die before Dilaf takes the country. Then comes the moment the whole book has been building to. Dilaf sets the dagger across Sarene's skin, and Hrathen watches it start to cut. For 20 years he has served his god through cold reason, and now, when it matters most, the reason deserts him. He thinks of the monk that gave his life to save a short walk, the massacre of Duladel, the mercy killing of an Elantrian, his love for the compassionate Sarene, and his long-held suppressed conscience all collide at this critical moment. Acting against his faith, he attacks Dilaf, his Derethi superior, and drags Sarene out. And then remember that priest that Hrathen sent home on his very first day in Arelon? The lazy one that he packed off to Fjorden to be retrained? Well, he's come back for Hrathen. He spent his exile at Rathbor, the monastery that trains assassins. And to get in, it cost him a kill, so Wyrn gave him a target: Hrathen. He finds him in a street and puts a knife in his chest. That wound should have finished Hrathen, but it hasn't. Not yet. He finds Dilaf again. At the moment, Dilaf has Raoden cornered, and with the one thing that Dakhor actually gave him, that single twisted bone in his forearm, he kills a fully transformed Dakhor monk with his bare hands. And by now, Hrathen is carrying 2 wounds that each should have killed him, the knife from Fjordell and the second from Dilaf, and Sarene later works out that what kept him alive was that same Dakhor bone. It wasn't enough to save him, just enough to hold off death for the few minutes that he needed. Brandon added that scene late. He said in the annotations that he did it just to close out the Hrathen and Dilaf relationship, and to turn Hrathen's time at Dakhor into an irony against the man who trained him. He also said he wanted his heroes to lose that fight, because he was writing a book where violence isn't the answer to everything. Neither Raoden nor Sarene win. The man who ends Dilaf is the man Dilaf made. In spite of his own religion sending an assassin to kill him, Hrathen tells Sarene that he still believes, just not in Wyrn, and not in the empire he spent the entire book serving. He's turned on them both, and just died fighting them. But the teachings themselves he keeps. He tells her plainly that he still holds on to the dearest doctrine. His issues was never with the faith or the god, only the man who claimed to speak for the god, and the conquest he ran in its name. If you've liked the video so far, like and subscribe so you can be there when the next video on the Ghostbloods go live. Anyway, let's continue. So what was this book doing with Hrathen? Brandon has said that Hrathen grew directly out of his own years as a full-time missionary. Brandon served in Korea, and he's pointed to the way an aggressive, actively preaching faith and a quieter, passive one sit side by side as the seed for the Derethi and Korathi dynamic in the book. Hrathen is the version of it that he seems to be most wary of. A man serving a faith as a system, a set of duties executed correctly, whose own conviction has quietly drained out from under the doctrine. It's telling that when Hrathen questions himself in the book, he never doubts whether Shu-Dereth is true. He just doubts whether he really belongs to it. Brandon built Hrathen to have the most progression of anyone in Elantris. Raoden and Sarene are tested by circumstance. The villain is the one who actually changes. As we have explored, Hrathen spends time in the book trying to reconcile his personal beliefs alongside those of Shu-Dereth. After reviewing Sanderson's commentary, it is clear that Hrathen represents Sanderson's own challenges in reconcile his scientific mind alongside the faith that he represents, and Sanderson questions Hrathen's methods. I would suggest that these methods are of Shu-Dereth. Indeed, the Wyrn wanted to aggressively dominate Arelon, while Hrathen's desires were more peaceful in nature. And the culmination of his story is a moment of redemption, where he finally manages to find that balance and refuse the Derethi methods, persisting with his own reading on the Derethi doctrine, without necessarily entirely adopting the methods that are adopted by its current members. I would also suggest that Taravangian's arc will share similarities to Hrathen's, after you disregard the religious element. They both make moves towards dismantling nations for a greater good. But for Hrathen, his logical arguments fell apart when the threat became personal and Sarene was under threat. And if you watch that video, I would suggest that Taravangian's own logic will fall apart through his granddaughter and the other Carbranthians that he has hidden in the spiritual realm for the back half of the series. The deeper Cosmere payoff, though, is that the theology he served, and who really built it. The planet Sel is a graveyard of gods. Long before the book opens, 2 shards of Adenausium settled this world, Devotion and Dominion. Odium hunted down both, killed their vessels and splintered them, trapping their raw power in the cognitive realm, where it pooled into a single reservoir of energy called the Door. Every magic on Sel runs on that one source, Aeon Door. The Aeon drawing the Elantrians are famous for is just the best known way of tapping into it. And the 2 great religions of Sel fall out of the same fault line. Shu-Dereth preaches unity through love, and Shu-Dereth preaches unity through obedience. Brandon has paired the 2 shards directly as love and conquest, devotion's intent and dominion. The mapping is hard to miss. Hrathen's church, faith of conquest and submission, is dominion-shaped, on a world where dominion itself was murdered before he was born. Yet Shu-Dereth, Sarene's religion, stems from devotion. The most devoted act in the entire book, a man throwing away his life for someone he loves, comes from a servant of dominion, in the name of a shard of love that no one on Sel remembers is dead. And the splinters of those dead shards are still there. The Seons, the gentle floating lights that serve Aeonic families, are the splinters of devotion. Their dark opposite, the Skarze, are splinters of dominion. And Brandon has stated plainly that they hold a large amount of influence over Fjordell politics. they were at least partly behind the plan to wipe out Elantris. So the genocide order Hrathen was sent to carry out may not have originated with the Wyrn at all. The community's reading, and it's a strong one, is that behind the God Emperor of Shu-Dereth sits the splinters of a dead god of dominion, steering an empire towards total control. How far they steer Wyrn personally is open, but that he's being steered at all is hard to dismiss. When Sanderson does eventually return to Sel, the Skarze and their dead shard are a threat still waiting. And so, at the end of the book, after Hrathen has died, fighting against members of his own religion, the residents of Arelon almost didn't bury him there. He was the very last grave dug, after the survivors argued over whether a Fjordell can be buried among the people who died defending their city. But Sarene, who spent 3 months treating this man as the single greatest threat to her country, overrules them. When you speak of this man, let it be known that he died in our defence. Let it be said that after all else, Hrathen, Bjorn of Shu-Dereth, was not our enemy. He was our saviour. And so, Hrathen was right. Back in Kai, before any of this, the day he looked over the city and told himself that he would be their saviour. He came as a servant of dominion and died in service of devotion. To close the video out, what I love about Hrathen is how perfect he is written in his simplicity. He is written as the primary antagonist in the book, and appears initially as a fanatic, and the hints are there early that he is more empathetic than it appears, and is open to questioning the Empire's methods, despite continuing to pursue its crusade. And his redemption is made complete when the cost becomes personal, and he can continue no longer. So here's what I'm left with. Can a man be judged on the one thing he finally got right, after a lifetime of getting everything else wrong for reasons that made perfect sense at the time? Or, like me, are you sold on his redemption? Like, subscribe, and get in the comments. Vote on the next topic in the community post, because if I have the question, maybe you do too. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.